This video is an account of an experience. My experience, watching and listening for the first time to the 2011 movie Melancholia, directed by the Danish filmmaker Lars von Trier. But rather than immediately start this video by sharing this experience, I would like to start this video with an invitation for you to stop this video. Well, to pause this video. If you can read musical staff notation and can hear how a score should sound, even if to a small degree, I invite you to pause this video and pull up two things and take them in before resuming this video. First, pull up the first 8 minutes of Melancholia, wherever you can find it, on a DVD, a streaming service, YouTube. There were multiple versions available on YouTube at the time of making this video. Second, pull up a score of the prelude, or introduction, to Richard Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. At the least, I would like you to pause this video and listen to the opening of the movie while following the score. If you haven't seen the movie and have a little extra time, I recommend that you watch and listen to the first 8 minutes of Melancholia first. If you have even more extra time and access, the entire movie, and then just listen to the first 8 minutes of the film again while reading the score. The film's music and the musical score should correspond closely, but not exactly. So again, if you have at least some fluency in reading music, I challenge you to pause the video, watch and listen as many times as you like, and see if you can notice anything that is, dare I say the word, wrong. Now, if you cannot read musical staff notation or hear how a score should sound, or cannot get access to the opening 8 minutes and a score, then feel free to keep me rolling. Otherwise, now it's time to pause, if you haven't already. Okay, you should be done with your preliminary screening. So, did you notice anything wrong? Well, yes, audio aside, there's the whole destruction of our planet demise. But is that wrong or just unfortunate? I should clarify how high the stakes are here as you ponder this question. Richard Wagner's prelude to Tristan und Isolde accompanies not only Die Erde-Dämmerung, that is the twilight of our planet, but also Die Lebendämmerung, because as we are told later in the film in no uncertain terms, life is only on Earth. The twilight of all life is unfortunate, I suppose, but wrong? We'll come back to that later. As you can guess with my opening setup, where I first noticed something wrong was in the music. In particular, I count 4 significant differences. Here are 2 of these differences displayed in graphic form. Along the left axis is Wagner's prelude counted in measures with some tonal, harmonic, and energetic annotations. And along the top axis is von Trier's prologue counted in seconds. You can see there was a cut in Wagner's music about a third of the way through Wagner's prelude, and about halfway through von Trier's prologue. Perhaps this was due to a sense of pacing. You may have noticed that von Trier was cutting on the beat, what he described in an interview as a vulgar defiance of unofficial film dogma that one should never cut on the beat. And then there's the end that was cut off. Whereas the climax of Wagner's prelude needs a post-climactic refractory period, the end of all life as we know it has no afterglow, however tonally shadowed, in which to bask. These differences are rather pragmatic and macroscopic ones, but neither of these was the difference that especially caught my ear when I first heard and saw Melancholia. That difference was here, near the very beginning. Here's the beginning of Wagner's original score in a grand staff reduction. Let me play just the audio of the third phrase of the Melancholia opening. Comparing the soundtrack recording to Wagner's score, the rising English horn moves too soon in this third phrase. This A is an eighth note too early. To me, this first sounded like, well, a mistake. An understandable one, to be sure, especially if the English horn player is taking their cue primarily, albeit myopically, from the pattern established by the first two phrases, where the top woodwind, first oboe, then clarinet, moves exactly 1/8 note before the English horn is to move. But this is a mistake that any conductor or recording engineer should catch and correct. Listen to dozens of commercial recordings of the very opening of Tristan und Isolde, and you will not hear a mistake like this. And yet it ends up at the start of this $7.4 million film. Why? Was it a mistake that slipped through the cracks, or was it pushed through those cracks? On the one hand, as Pascal Rudolph discusses in his 2022 book on pre-existing music in von Trier's films, the director has a predilection for making and keeping mistakes in his movies. Quote, "These examples and the quoted script excerpts show that imperfection does not occur accidentally, but is understood as a goal in the film production." Unquote. On the other hand, the film's editor shared with Rudolph his concern that Melancholia in particular violated this predilection because it's too beautiful, too neat, and somehow too perfect. Well, that was not my experience. To my ears, imperfection was definitely achieved in Melancholia scarcely a minute into the movie. But how does anyone, notice this imperfection, this rogue note? In his book, Rudolph finds this change hardly noticeable, kaum vernehmbar. However, this is not as fleeting of a difference as it might look on the page, considering that an eighth note lasts a full second in this music, and nothing moves faster than an eighth note in at least these opening measures. Perhaps one could recognize it as a stylistic deviation, a change from what Wagner in particular, or a 19th century German composer in general, or a common practice composer even more in general tends to do. Well, the premature note contains a consonant minor triad in place of Wagner's augmented triad. In common practice styles, an augmented triad rather than a minor triad would be more often used as a brief, weak beat passing chord as part of a prolongation of a more stable sonority. And this is what Wagner does in his original, although the harmonic endpoints of his phrase are seventh chords. However, by, mistakenly, placing a consonant triad as an embellishing chord in between more structurally weighted but dissonant harmonies, the Melancholia version inverts this usual hierarchy. But that's not why I noticed it. Perhaps this inversion did not call attention to the mistake because, in contrast to many other common practice composers, Wagner himself was known to invoke this inversion, as musicologist Robert Morgan recognized in the third act to Wagner's later opera, Parsifal. This mistake, therefore, actually resonates with Wagner's own idiolect. Also, this mistake creates parallel perfect fifths with the melody that were not there before. These parallel perfect fifths contrast with most of the music of Tristan's time and place that seems to make considerable effort to avoid parallel perfect fifths. David Huron's theory for this avoidance is that common practice composers prefer to keep voices perceptually segregated from one another, and parallel perfect fifths work against this goal, causing two voices to briefly fuse together as a single timbre, which confuses the auditory scene. However, I did not notice the mistake because of such a confusion. I noticed it because I know this opening music very well, more than many other pieces of music, not out of coincidence, but because the Tristan Prelude, especially its opening, is one of the most lionized and analyzed works in all of Western music. In hearing a performance of such a canonized museum piece, recreating its organization is as ritualistic of an affair for the musical acolyte as charting the motions of the celestial bodies is for the seasoned astronomer. In this metaphor, the playing and replaying of the same music over and over again, especially when automated through recording technology, is the harmony of the spheres. Over and over, the notes trace fixed orbits through space and time. A mere eighth note duration and a mere semitone in the vastness of Wagner's score universe can be the difference between whether one keeps or scraps a studio take, just as mere hundreds of thousands of miles in the vastness of the cosmic universe can be the difference between whether all life in this universe dies or not. But although this mistake brings about the collapse of the Tristan Prelude universe, the devastating deviation surfaces in a local environment of concord and union. The errant English horn tone is a bringer of triadic pleasure, as the planet Melancholia is admired for its beauty. Also, the English horn embraces and envelops the higher melodic pitch as an overtone through parallel perfect fifths, matching how the rogue planet parallels Earth's course and ultimately subsumes it. So this was the graph for the film's prologue. Let's now bring up a graph that shows how the Tristan Prelude is used during the entire film. Rudolph has a similar graph in his book. Von Trier divides the film almost exactly in half, labeling the two parts Justine and Claire, respectively, the names of the two sisters played by Kirsten Dunst and Charlotte Gainsbourg. In the first half, melancholic Justine psychologically unwinds during her wedding reception that prim Claire has painstakingly arranged. The second part reverses this relationship, as Justine demonstrates to Claire how to accept and face the apparent end of the world. The music contributes in fairly obvious ways to large-scale formal structure. For example, the end of the prelude also concludes the first part of the movie, and Earth's destruction, shown twice in the film, is coupled with the prelude's climax in measure 83. But one criticism of the use of music in Melancholia is that the film mercilessly and needlessly subjects the listener to several orbits or suborbits of all or part of Wagner's prelude. Alex Ross, music critic of The New Yorker, writes in his blog that, quote, Von Trier dwells so relentlessly on the opening of the prelude that it turns into a kind of cloying signature tune. Repetition robs the music of its capacity to surprise and seduce the listener, unquote. You can see the emphasis on the prelude's opening material in my graph. Zachary Wolfe, a freelance music critic for the New York Times, writes that in Melancholia, quote, relentless repetitions of music from Tristan und Isolde did little beyond telegraph the most obvious and superficial emotional cues, unquote. I appreciate these views and have found myself moving toward them more as I watched the film more and more. However, during my initial experience of the film, the subsequent repetitions of the opening measures actually held me rapt, because I couldn't wait to find out if the English horn's mistake in measure 10 of the prologue would come back in later presentations of measure 10. While Ross and Wolfe found the repetitions tedious, I found them generating palpable tension in that I anxiously waited to hear if subsequent playings would conform to Wagner's original or include the wrong English horn note or something else. So when the music returned at the 23-minute mark for the first time since the prologue, I was pleasantly surprised to hear a different recording of measure 10, where the English horn did not make a mistake. Gone was the embellishing minor triad and the fusing parallel perfect fifths. Now, bear in mind that in the film's narrative, most people on Earth, and perhaps some easily duped moviegoers, believe that the planet Melancholia is going to come close but only fly by, avoiding cosmic misfortune. Perhaps now being in an alternate musical universe, one where the English horn performer had restored order, had restored the harmony of the spheres, meant that we had escaped the doomsday scenario of the prologue, and that those characters in the movie who believe in the flyby might actually be right because the music says so. Of course, this is Lars von Trier we are talking about here, but the music at the 23-minute mark had suggested to me the slim chance that perhaps the end is not nigh. So with each measure 10, I listened closely, like Claire's erudite and hopeful husband looking through the telescope, finding comfort with each view as the universe circulates through its eternal and collision-free choreography, and each listen as the English horn plays its line correctly. The moments, however, when measure 10 was approached but withheld, especially those in part 2, made me nervous. It was in this part 2 that Justine reveals to Claire that in mysterious ways she knows things, like there is only life on Earth and not for long. She also feels that life on Earth is evil, and in her actions she appears to be welcoming her union with the planet Melancholia, along with her own imminent destruction. And yet, radical optimism kept me hoping that the early English horn note of the prologue offered a clue to the film's ultimate dualism of universes, and that the musical and cosmic mistake of the prologue would remain separate from the film proper. I should have known better. While the errant English horn note that accompanied a foreseen destruction never returns at the end of the movie, the destruction of the Earth certainly does. At the opening of the video, I said that I had recognized 4 significant differences between Wagner's music and the music in the film. If you have been counting, you may have noticed that I've only mentioned 3 so far. The 2 major cuts in the opening 8 minutes, and the rogue English horn note. What was my 4th? Well, here's a hint. At the beginning of this video, I invited you to experience the opening of Melancholia on a DVD, a streaming service, YouTube, wherever you could find it. Depending on where you found it, you may or may not have experienced this 4th difference like I did, regardless of how good of a listener you are. Melancholia was shot and mastered at 25 frames per second, but distributed digitally in 2 different versions. One version, lasting 130 minutes, that preserves this 25 frames per second rate, and one version lasting 135 minutes that slows to 24 frames per second. This lengthening of the second version drops its pitch by 71 cents, nearly a full semitone. Unlike some of my European counterparts, I, as a North American, experienced the film's music as down a half step from Wagner's original, because I watched the longer version. To confirm that the music was not performed down a half step, I listened to the original soundtrack recording. Yes, there was a commercially released soundtrack recording featuring multiple different recordings of the same prelude, which might seem ridiculous, but the soundtrack does preserve the different English horn takes, one with the measure 10 mistake and the rest without. So here's the opening of the first phrase that I heard. And here's the opening of the first phrase from the soundtrack recording. So it turns out that I was in an alternate musical universe the whole time, but one that seemed completely familiar, one that seemed just fine, one where people are generally happy about getting married, and one where the Earth is on no collision course with a massive planet. Only those with both the arcane knowledge of Wagner's music and the arcane ability of absolute pitch would be able to detect this difference. Just like Justine knows things, that she possesses some arcane access to information about the universe that most people cannot perceive. But how does this wholesale semitonal shift affect the English horn mistake? The fact that the version I experienced was lowered by a half step means that what we have been considering in the prologue as wrong, as a mistake, from the vantage point of Wagner's score, a rogue English horn note that rose a semitone and eighth note too early, is actually correct, is actually right. This musical corrective eerily matches Justine's view that all life in the universe is wicked, but a rogue planet's deviation from the universe's design turns out to be justified because it brings all of its evil to an end. In both cases, two wrongs make a right. So there it is, my account of the experience watching and listening to Lars von Trier's Melancholia for the first time.